Jack Nicholson has not appeared in a film since 2010. That is 15 years of silence from the man who was, by any honest measure, the most magnetic actor Hollywood ever produced. 3 Academy Awards, 12 nominations, a career that spanned 5 decades without a single forgettable era. And then nothing. No farewell tour, no retirement speech, no carefully managed exit. Just absence. The kind that makes you wonder whether leaving was the bravest thing he ever did. Stay with me, because what happened next will genuinely change how you see success. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something real. Jack Nicholson spent 50 years being exactly what everyone needed him to be, on screen and off. The rebel, the charmer, the dangerous one. And when he finally stopped, the world called it decline. But what if walking away from the thing that made you famous is actually the hardest kind of courage there is? I want to know what you think. Drop it in the comments. Would you have the strength to walk away from the one thing the whole world loved you for, especially if staying was slowly hollowing you out? Tell me honestly. I read every single one. There is a specific kind of man Hollywood produces and then consumes. You know the type. The ones who arrive so fully formed, so completely themselves, that the industry has no choice but to build itself around them rather than the other way around. Jack Nicholson was that man. He did not chase Hollywood. Hollywood circled him. He grew up in Neptune, New Jersey, raised by a woman he believed was his sister until he was 37 years old. That detail alone tells you something important. In 1974, Time magazine broke the story. The woman he called his mother was actually his grandmother. The woman he called his sister was his mother. She had died in 1963 without ever telling him. Jack found out not from family, not from anyone who loved him, but from a journalist doing research. Think about that for a moment. The man who would go on to play the Joker, Randall McMurphy, and Frank Costello. A man whose entire screen presence was built on a kind of fearless, unfiltered truth, had been living inside a family lie for nearly 4 decades. Psychologists who study identity formation describe this kind of late-stage revelation as a foundational rupture. It does not just change facts. It reaches backward through your entire life and quietly rewrites what everything meant. Every memory, every moment of feeling known or unknown, all of it shifts. And Jack, to his credit, did not fall apart publicly. He absorbed it. He processed it in the only language he had ever truly trusted: performance. According to multiple interviews he gave throughout the 1970s and 1980s, including a deeply candid conversation with Rolling Stone in 1986, he said the discovery made him feel more free rather than more broken. He called it clarifying. But here is the question that most people never thought to ask about that answer. When the truth about your entire foundation gets revealed by a stranger, and your response is to feel freed by it, what does that tell you about how trapped you already were? Jack Nicholson built one of the greatest careers in cinema history. He was beloved, feared, desired, and endlessly fascinating. He won everything worth winning. He lived in a way most people only imagine. And somewhere inside all of that, something was always slightly out of reach. The strange thing is, the people closest to him during his peak years all described the same quality. A warmth that pulled you in completely, and a door, somewhere just behind the warmth, that was never, ever open. Most actors spend their whole lives searching for their authentic self on screen. Jack Nicholson found his so early, and so completely, that it became impossible to tell where the performance ended and the person began. There is a term in performance psychology called character capture. It describes what happens when an actor inhabits a role so deeply, so repeatedly, that the boundaries between self and character begin to dissolve. It is most commonly studied in long-running theater performers and method actors. But the version that happened to Jack Nicholson was different, more subtle, and in many ways more permanent. He did not lose himself in individual characters. He did something more complex. He built one master persona, the grinning, magnetic, boundary-dissolving rogue, and wore it so consistently across 50 years that it became indistinguishable from his actual identity. Not just to the public, to the people who knew him personally, and perhaps most dangerously to himself. His early career tells the story clearly if you know what to look for. Before Easy Rider in 1969 changed everything, Jack had spent nearly a decade grinding through low-budget films that went nowhere. Roger Corman Productions, beach party films, forgettable westerns. According to a 1984 profile in Esquire, he came within weeks of abandoning acting entirely to focus on writing and directing. He was 30 years old, nearly broke, and invisible. Then Easy Rider happened almost by accident. The original actor dropped out. Jack stepped in, and the version of himself he brought to that role, loose, dangerous, darkly funny, alive in a way the screen had rarely seen, landed like a revelation. Here is what matters about that moment. The persona that made him famous was not carefully constructed. It was not the result of years of studied craft. It erupted. It came out fully formed because it had been compressed inside him for 30 years with nowhere to go. And the world did not just accept it. The world went delirious for it. In 1970, he received his first Academy Award nomination for Easy Rider. In 1971, The Last Detail. In 1974, Chinatown. In 1975, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, for which he won his first Oscar. In the space of 6 years, he went from near invisibility to being considered the defining actor of his generation. As the New York Times noted in a retrospective piece in 2003, no actor in the sound era had accumulated that level of critical and commercial momentum in so short a window. But momentum of that kind has a physics to it that nobody warns you about. When the world decides it loves a specific version of you, and rewards that version with money, desire, fame, and validation on a scale most humans cannot even conceptualize, the pressure to remain that version becomes almost gravitational. You do not choose to stay in character. The character simply becomes the path of least resistance. And over time, least resistance becomes the only path you remember how to walk. The women in Jack's life during this period describe something consistent across dozens of interviews and biographical accounts. A man of extraordinary presence and genuine tenderness who would, without warning or explanation, simply become unavailable. Not physically, emotionally, as though a light had been switched off behind his eyes and he had retreated somewhere no one was allowed to follow. Angelica Houston, who spent 17 years in a relationship with him, one of the longest and most documented partnerships of his life, spoke about this quality in her memoir Watch Me, published in 2014. She described a man capable of profound connection who seemed almost constitutionally unable to sustain it. Not out of cruelty, out of something that looked, from the outside, like fear dressed up as freedom. And that distinction matters enormously, because the story the public told about Jack Nicholson for 50 years was that he was a man who wanted everything and took it. The rebel who answered to no one. The one who lived completely on his own terms. But the story his closest relationships tell is quieter and more complicated. It is the story of a man who learned very young that the people who were supposed to be permanent could disappear or deceive without warning, and who spent the rest of his life building a persona so complete, so entertaining, so utterly magnetic, that no one would ever need to look past it. The mask fit perfectly. That was exactly the problem. Because here is what nobody ever thought to ask. If the persona was the protection, what was it protecting against? And what happens to a man like that when the cameras finally stop rolling and there is nothing left to perform? There is a specific kind of loneliness that only arrives after you have won everything. Jack Nicholson knew that loneliness better than almost anyone alive. And for a long time he was brilliant at making it look like contentment. By the mid-1980s, Jack Nicholson was not just famous. He was something rarer and more durable than famous. He was iconic. There is a difference. Famous means people recognize your face. Iconic means people have decided you represent something larger than yourself. Something they need to believe in. And once a culture decides that about you, it stops seeing you as a person entirely. You become a symbol, a projection screen for other people's ideas about freedom, rebellion, and the life they wish they had the courage to live. The financial architecture of his success was staggering in ways that even now do not get discussed properly. His decision to take a back-end profit participation deal on the original Batman in 1989, rather than a flat acting fee, resulted in a payout estimated by Variety at the time to be somewhere between $50 and $60 million from that single film alone. That is not adjusted for inflation. That is $1,989. For context, that figure represented more money than the entire production budget of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, multiplied several times over. It was one of the most financially intelligent single decisions in Hollywood history, made by a man the industry had always underestimated as purely instinctive rather than strategic. He bought property on Mulholland Drive in Los Angeles and quietly assembled one of the most significant private art collections in America. According to a 2004 investigation by the Los Angeles Times, his collection included works by Picasso, Matisse, and a range of contemporary artists whose combined estimated value ran into the tens of millions. He did not display this collection publicly. He did not loan pieces to museums for prestige. He simply lived with them, in private, in a house most people never entered. That house became its own kind of mythology. The Mulholland Drive property was simultaneously his fortress and his performance space. He hosted gatherings there that were the stuff of Hollywood legend, intimate, electric, attended by the most interesting people in the world. And yet, according to multiple accounts from people who attended regularly, including details surfaced in Patrick McGilligan's exhaustive 1994 biography Jack's Life, there was always a quality to those evenings that was difficult to name. A sense that you were being welcomed completely and held at arm's length at exactly the same time. His romantic life during this period reflected the same architecture. A succession of relationships with extraordinary women, Angelica Houston, Rebecca Broussard, Laura Flynn Boyle, each of which followed a pattern that, when you lay them side by side, becomes almost impossible to ignore. Intense connection, genuine warmth, and then a gradual withdrawal that was never quite explained and never quite complete. He fathered 5 children by 4 different women. He was by most accounts a present and loving father in the specific ways he could manage. But the kind of sustained, unglamorous, daily emotional availability that long-term partnership requires, that remained consistently out of reach. Psychologists who study attachment theory describe this pattern as avoidant attachment with compensatory charm. The individual is not cold. They are frequently the opposite, magnetic, generous, deeply engaging in short bursts. But genuine sustained intimacy triggers an almost automatic withdrawal response. The defense mechanism is so deeply embedded that the person often cannot identify it as a defense at all. It simply feels like who they are. For Jack, the defense had an additional layer of protection that most people never have. His persona was so culturally beloved, so universally accepted as authentic, that no one ever seriously questioned whether it might be a construction. When a man grins that wide and lives that large, the assumption is that he must be happy, that he must be whole. The performance was so convincing that it convinced everyone, including, perhaps, himself. What you are watching unfold in this story is something the highlight reels never show. The private mathematics of a public life. The real cost of being exactly what the world decided it needed you to be. Stories told this honestly about people this iconic are rare. If you want to be here every time we do this, subscribe now. We are just getting started. And then came the moment everything quietly began to change. Not a scandal, not a breakdown, something slower and in many ways more profound. In 2001, his close friend and neighbor Marlon Brando lost his son Christian to prison and grief. In 2004, Brando himself died. The losses accumulated in a way that Jack had not experienced since that revelation about his family back in 1974. Except now he was older, and the persona that had always absorbed everything before was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to show its weight. A source close to his inner circle, quoted in a 2010 Vanity Fair profile, described a Jack Nicholson in his late 60s who had become noticeably quieter at the gatherings that had once been his natural habitat. Not sad exactly, but contemplative in a way that felt new, as though he was looking at his own life from a slight distance for the first time and finding the view genuinely surprising. He made The Departed in 2006, a brilliant, ferocious performance, and then How Do You Know in 2010, and then silence. Not the silence of a man who had run out of offers, the silence of a man who had finally run out of reasons to keep saying yes. Everything looked exactly as it always had from the outside. The house on Mulholland Drive, the Lakers games, the grin that had launched 1,000 magazine covers. But something had shifted at a level no camera could reach. And 90 days after How Do You Know Wrapped, he never stepped on a film set again. Most people assume Jack Nicholson's disappearance from Hollywood was something that happened to him. A slow fade caused by age, health, memory. But the people who were actually there describe something far more deliberate, far more considered, and far more human. There is a concept in behavioral psychology called identity foreclosure. It describes the moment when a person has invested so completely in a single version of themselves that they lose the psychological ability to imagine being anyone else. It is most commonly studied in elite athletes approaching retirement. The jersey comes off and something fundamental collapses, because the identity was never separate from the performance. They were always the same thing. Hollywood produces this condition at an industrial scale, and it consumes the people it creates with a thoroughness that is almost elegant in its cruelty. The industry does not fire you loudly. It simply stops calling. The invitations thin. The scripts arrive less frequently, then infrequently, then not at all. And the person who spent 50 years being the most wanted man in every room suddenly has to figure out who they are in a room where nobody is watching. For most actors, this process is involuntary and devastating. For Jack Nicholson, something different happened. And this is the part of the story that almost no coverage has gotten right. According to people with direct knowledge of his life during this period, including details that emerged across several carefully reported pieces in publications including The Hollywood Reporter and Esquire between 2013 and 2019, Jack did not experience the end of his career as a loss. He experienced it as a door opening. The question was simply whether he had the courage to walk through it after 50 years of standing in front of cameras instead. He had turned 70 in 2007. His vision had begun to deteriorate in ways that made learning lines, always the mechanical foundation of the work, genuinely difficult. This detail has been reported carefully and without cruelty by several sources, and Jack himself alluded to it in one of his last public interviews, a brief exchange with a journalist at a Lakers game in 2013 where he said, simply that he was taking it easy and that the right project had not come along. The tone was relaxed, almost relieved, but the vision difficulties were only part of the story. Perhaps the smaller part. The larger part was this. In 2009, 1 year before his final film, Jack became a grandfather for the first time. His daughter Jennifer, born from his relationship with actress Sandra Knight in the 1960s, had a child. And something in Jack, something that had been carefully insulated from the full weight of personal life for 5 decades, cracked open in a way he had not anticipated and could not perform his way around. Multiple people close to him during this period described a man genuinely surprised by his own emotional response. Not the polished, cinematic version of grandfatherly warmth. Something rawer, more private, more real than anything he had allowed himself to feel publicly in years. Psychologists who study late-life emotional development describe a phenomenon called affective awakening, a period, often triggered by the arrival of grandchildren or the loss of close peers, in which individuals who have spent their adult lives managing emotional distance suddenly find that distance no longer functional. The defenses that served them for decades begin to feel less like protection and more like deprivation. For a man whose foundational childhood experience was the discovery that love and identity could be built on a hidden lie, the arrival of a new generation, a clean slate, a relationship with no history of performance or persona, would have represented something almost incomprehensibly valuable. And here is what that means in practical terms. The career that had consumed Jack Nicholson for 50 years was built on being watched, on being needed, on filling a room so completely that no one ever had to ask what was underneath. And suddenly there was something in his life that required the precise opposite. Presence without performance. Attention without audience. Love that had no interest whatsoever in the grin or the legend or the 3 Academy Awards.